Chris McCandless. Chris McCandless was an American drifter who died in 1992 while living alone in the Alaskan wilderness after attempting a solitary backcountry experiment in self-reliance. In April 1992, McCandless hitchhiked to the edge of Denali National Park and walked into the bush with a .22 rifle, limited rice supplies, and a handful of field guides. He settled in an abandoned Fairbanks City bus used by hunters as shelter. He intended to live off the land for the summer. At first, he hunted small game and foraged edible plants. His journal entries reflected optimism and physical resilience. By July, his weight had dropped severely. Large game proved difficult to preserve. Caloric intake declined. Attempts to leave the area were blocked by a swollen Teklanika River, which he had crossed months earlier under lower water levels. Weakness progressed into starvation. Later analysis suggested that seeds he consumed may have contained a neurotoxin that inhibited nutrient absorption, accelerating his decline. By August, he could no longer travel. He died alone inside the bus, weighing approximately 6-7 pounds. His death was not sudden. It unfolded through isolation, limited preparation, and the assumption that wilderness would yield to determination. There were no communication devices, no contingency routes, no reliable maps marking seasonal river changes. The experiment in radical independence ended in predictable biological limits. Nature did not respond to philosophy. Henry Worsley. Henry Worsley was a British explorer who died in 2016 after attempting a solo unsupported crossing of Antarctica. Worsley set out in November 2015 with the goal of completing a 1,100-mile trek across Antarctica without resupply or assistance. He was an experienced former Army officer and had previously completed long polar expeditions as part of teams. This time, he pulled a sled weighing over 300 pounds across shifting ice and sastrugi ridges. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees. Progress was steady but physically punishing. By late January, after 71 days alone, Worsley was within roughly 30 miles of his destination. His body was failing. Severe dehydration and exhaustion had set in. He developed bacterial peritonitis, an infection in the abdominal lining that becomes life-threatening without rapid treatment. Alone on the ice, he made a satellite call requesting evacuation. He was airlifted to a research station and then to a hospital in Chile. He died on the 24th of January, 2016. The expedition did not fail because of inexperience. It failed because the margin between endurance and organ failure in Antarctica is narrow. Solo travel removed the possibility of shared load or early intervention. Every calorie deficit compounds. Every minor infection accelerates. Worsley had nearly completed the crossing. Nearly was not survivable. Robert Falcon Scott. Robert Falcon Scott was a British naval officer who led the Terra Nova expedition to the South Pole and died during the return journey in 1912. Scott reached the South Pole on the 17th of January 1912, only to find that Roald Amundsen had arrived weeks earlier. The disappointment was recorded in restrained diary entries. The greater danger lay ahead. Scott's 5-man team began the 800-mile return march across the Antarctic plateau with limited rations and weakening bodies. Their transport strategy had already faltered. Motor sledges failed early. Ponies succumbed to cold and were shot. Man-hauling sledges across deep snow consumed calories faster than planned. Edgar Evans deteriorated first, likely from a head injury and scurvy. He died on February 17. Lawrence Oates, suffering from severe frostbite and gangrene, walked out of the tent into a blizzard in March, reportedly saying he, "Maybe sometime." He did not return. Scott and the remaining 2 men pressed on but were halted by relentless storms just 11 miles from a supply depot. They died inside their tent in late March 1912. The expedition's collapse was not caused by a single miscalculation. It was the accumulation of logistical overconfidence, underestimation of Antarctic conditions, and nutritional planning that proved inadequate. Scott's final letters expressed concern for the families of his men. The weather reports later confirmed that the region experienced unusually severe conditions that season. The margin for survival had already been thin. George Mallory. George Mallory was a British mountaineer who disappeared on Mount Everest in 1924 during an attempt to reach the summit. On the 8th of June 1924, Mallory and his climbing partner Andrew Irvine were last seen high on the northeast ridge of Everest, moving steadily upward through thinning air. The British expedition had already endured weeks of acclimatization failures, equipment limitations, and violent weather shifts. Oxygen apparatus was experimental and unreliable. Mallory, 37 years old, had already attempted the summit twice that season. A third attempt pushed into what is now called the death zone, above 8,000 meters, where the human body begins to deteriorate rapidly. Clouds rolled in. The pair vanished. For 75 years, what happened remained uncertain. In 1999, Mallory's body was discovered at 8,155 meters. He had suffered a broken leg and a rope injury around his waist, suggesting a fall while roped together. Irvine was never found. The camera they carried, which might have revealed whether they reached the summit before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay decades later, has not been recovered. The failure was not dramatic in the moment. It was incremental. Incomplete oxygen systems, limited weather forecasting, a culture of imperial achievement that rewarded persistence over retreat. Mallory once said he climbed Everest because it's there. The mountain did not negotiate. It did not need to. David Sharp. David Sharp was a British mountaineer who died on Mount Everest in 2006 after becoming incapacitated near the summit during a solo ascent. Sharp attempted Everest without a personal guide and with limited financial backing, joining a commercial expedition but climbing largely independently. On May 14, he reached high altitude late in the day, moving slowly near a limestone overhang known as Green Boots Cave, named after a previously deceased climber whose body remained there as a landmark. Oxygen supplies were minimal. Temperatures dropped sharply after sunset. At elevations above 8,000 meters, judgment degrades and coordination falters. Sharp stopped moving and sat within the rock alcove. Over the next several hours, dozens of climbers passed him while ascending or descending. Some assumed he was another body fixed in place by cold. Others reported that he was still alive but unresponsive. Rescue at that altitude requires multiple strong climbers, spare oxygen, and significant physical risk. No coordinated attempt was made in time. By morning, he had died from hypothermia and exposure. The incident prompted debate about commercial mountaineering and ethical obligations in the death zone. Everest had become crowded, with summit schedules tightly managed and margins thin. Turning around to attempt a rescue can mean forfeiting years of preparation and tens of thousands of dollars. In the final hours, Sharp remained seated in view of the route. The mountain did not conceal him. It simply required more strength than anyone offered. Lincoln Hall. Mark Inglis survived Everest, but Lincoln Hall was an Australian climber who was left for dead on Mount Everest in 2006 after being declared beyond rescue during descent from the summit. Hall reached the summit on the 25th of May 2006 as part of a guided expedition. During the descent, he began showing signs of cerebral edema, a high-altitude condition that causes confusion, loss of coordination, and eventual unconsciousness. Oxygen supplies ran low. Weather conditions deteriorated. His guides attempted to help him down but were moving slowly in the death zone, where prolonged exposure can kill rescuers as well as victims. After hours of effort, the team radioed base camp and reported that Hall had died. They were instructed to descend to save themselves. He was left sitting upright, clipped to a rope, exposed overnight at nearly 8,700 meters. Against expectation, Hall regained consciousness the next morning. Severely frostbitten and disoriented, he was discovered by another climbing team who realized he was alive. A complex rescue effort involving multiple climbers and additional oxygen brought him down the mountain over many hours. He survived, though with lasting injuries. The decision to leave him was not made lightly. At extreme altitude, rescue capacity collapses quickly. Every minute spent assisting someone immobile increases risk for others. Hall's survival was statistically improbable. His case exposed how expedition structures prioritize summit success and scheduled descent over contingency flexibility. On Everest, official declarations of death can be logistical calculations rather than medical certainty. Alex Lowe. Alex Lowe was an American mountaineer who died in 1999 after being caught in an avalanche on Mount Shishapangma in Tibet. Lowe was widely regarded as one of the strongest climbers of his generation. In October 1999, he joined a small team attempting Shishapangma's south face, a technically demanding and avalanche-prone route. The group was moving between camps when a massive slab avalanche released high above them. Snow fractured without warning and accelerated down the face. Lowe, cameraman David Bridges, and fellow climber Conrad Anker were in its path. Anker survived after being carried and partially buried but managed to dig himself out. Lowe and Bridges were swept away and buried under dense debris. Immediate rescue was impossible. The slope remained unstable, and the force of the slide had scattered equipment and bodies across crevasses. After hours of searching in dangerous conditions, the effort was halted. The mountain was still shifting. The accident was not the result of recklessness in the conventional sense. Himalayan expeditions routinely accept avalanche exposure as part of the objective risk profile. Weather patterns had appeared stable. Snowpack assessment at extreme altitude is imprecise. A single weak layer beneath accumulated wind-loaded snow can fail without audible warning. Lowe's body was not recovered until 2016, when melting glacial ice exposed remains near camp. The delay underscored how mountains preserve and conceal simultaneously. In high-altitude climbing, skill reduces probability. It does not eliminate it. The avalanche required no mistake in that moment. Gravity was sufficient. Doug Hansen. Doug Hansen was an American postal worker who died during the 1996 Mount Everest disaster after attempting to summit late in deteriorating weather. Hansen was a client on Rob Hall's guided expedition. He had attempted Everest the previous year but turned back short of the summit. In May 1996, he returned, determined to reach the top. On summit day May 10, delays at fixed ropes and congestion high on the mountain pushed climbers hours behind schedule. Standard turnaround times were exceeded. Oxygen supplies were calculated tightly around planned descent windows. Hansen reached the summit in the early afternoon, significantly later than recommended. By then, wind speeds were increasing, and a storm system was advancing. On the descent, he became exhausted and struggled to continue. Rob Hall remained with him near the south summit, attempting to assist him down. Oxygen ran critically low. Communication with base camp confirmed worsening conditions. Other climbers were also in distress across the mountain. As night fell, Hansen lost consciousness. Rescue above 8,500 meters during a blizzard was not viable. Hall refused to leave him and would also die overnight. The disaster ultimately claimed 8 lives across multiple teams. Hansen's death reflected more than personal determination. It exposed the tension between commercial expedition structure, client ambition, guide responsibility, and environmental reality. A delayed turnaround by hours became fatal by nightfall. At that altitude, schedules are not suggestions, they are survival limits.